Hey guys, well, a lot of you have been so supportive on the other carburetor videos I've done. I wanted to take time to make another one that addresses something that I get a lot of questions on, and it's going to be done in my usual off-the-cuff manner, and it's not going to be highly technical, but I want to do it in a way that you guys can understand. So it may not be something you've heard before in a way that you've heard it, but I think you will probably know as much as I do after this if I've done my job correctly. And again, I want to thank all of you that watch my carburetor videos and ask me questions. I really enjoy helping you guys. So I know some people, it's easier for them to read something than it is to hear it explained to them. So, you know, if the video doesn't make sense, feel free to ask me a question. So what this video is going to be about, it's going to be about carburetor floats. How do carburetor floats work? Carburetor float is an integral part of the operation of a carburetor because it regulates the amount of fuel that is inside the carburetor bowl at any one time. Now we've got an example carb here that's long since been disassembled. If you look down in here, there's a space right here, open space. It's a reservoir for fuel, so anytime the engine's running, then the the float is, they sound the same, don't they? Choke, float, choke. The float is responsible for just maintaining the correct amount of fuel in this float bowl. This is called a float bowl. And before we go further, I want to explain something that will hopefully make you remember this because it's kind of funny. But a carburetor float works almost identical to a toilet float. The float that's in your commode, you know, in the back in the tank, you know, when you flush the commode and it does the job of flushing, and then it refills, you know, it refills up, and it's got like some of the newer ones all have like a little thing comes up that floats on the water, and then the old ones had the old arm that goes out with a big bulb on the end of it. That's the old ones. I remember those from when I was a kid. But the operation's the same. The water level pushes the device up, and then when it gets to a preset point, it closes off a valve, the water stops flowing, and the water stops. Now, that's exactly what happens in here. So if you have a problem with either of these, if you had a problem with your toilet and the water didn't shut off, then you've got a little overflow pipe in there, and it just keeps running water, and it just keeps running, and you can't get it to quit, and you have to turn the valve off. Now normally a commode doesn't flood the floor from doing that, but the carburetor can though. If a carburetor has a problem with the float, and we will take a closer look at the floats here in just a minute or two, but if it had a problem with the float, and say that float got stuck, or it got the needle that's on the end of it that's supposed to do the actual job of shutting off the fuel flow, it gets dirt in it, or it gets the end of it gets worn, or it gets something, it's marred it up and it doesn't seal anymore, then it, you know, your fuel pump on an engine is always working. It's always doing its job to try to force fuel into the carburetor. So as long as the engine's running, you're going to have 3, 4, 5, 6 pounds of fuel pressure coming into this carburetor, and it's always trying to fill this thing up. So it's the float's job to shut that fuel off. Now it doesn't, you know, it's not like a commode where it fills up and it just stays there. You know, the engine is always consuming fuel, so the fuel is, not only is there fuel coming into it in the inlet where the float is and the inlet valve, then it's going out, you know, through the main jets and into the intake through the carburetor passages to operate the engine. The engine won't run without fuel, of course. So that's how that works in a very broad sense. So you have fuel going in, then you have fuel being consumed by the engine, but you have to maintain a balance in there. So say, you know, for instance, a couple scenarios. Say that you were just idling along, or you parked somewhere just letting the engine run and no real load on it, and so it's the engine is using very little fuel at that point. So the float level, of course, you know, the float level, it's not always going to stay the same, but at that point it would be almost as to its high level. Means the float's raised up in here. It's the float for example, we'll do this one, show you how that looks. The float is going to pivot, and so the float would be at a very low load condition, would be up near the top, so it would be at the point that it would always be almost about to shut the flow of fuel off. It's only letting enough in to keep it filled up because there's not that much going out into the engine. So say that you were later on, you were pulling a mountain and you had a load on a truck or something, and you really had the gas down and that thing was really drawing a lot of fuel in, so it would be you know, ideally the fuel pump is able to keep the float bowl filled up no matter what. So you know, the float may have dropped some, but you know, it's still got plenty of fuel in reserve, so it's not going to starve and it's not going to run out, ideally. Now there are engines that can totally drain a quadrajet float bowl. That's a big engine making a whole lot of power, but they can do it. But that's what the float does, and there's not many parts to it. It's got it's got a float, it's got a pivot, it's got some point that it's going to pivot on, and it has and you're gonna have to forgive me, I looked and looked for an actual needle valve, but I didn't have one. I throw all the old ones away when I rebuild a carburetor, and I don't keep them. But you know, it's simply that you're gonna have a float up here, it's on a pivot like right there, and then when the float comes down, look when this end there where the float itself is, and it comes up, raises up, the fuel level raises up, it pushes down on the opposite end. It's like a teeter-totter. You know, when you were in school, a teeter-totter is balanced in the middle. You got one person over here, one person over there, and it kind of balances itself. This is not in the middle, of course, but it's the same principle. So this thing, when the fuel fills and it pushes up on this end of it, it pushes the opposite end down. So that opposite end works against a needle valve, which pretend this is one. It's kind of shaped like one, at least. Pushes down on the top of that, and the end of this, what would be the valve, has a little rubber tip on it. So when it pushes that little needle valve down, it's inside. This is called the seat. Screws into the carburetor. It's got little outlets right here that let the fuel flow easier. And so you look down in there, it's got a little orifice in there, and that's where all the fuel comes in, if you can believe that. It's not very big, is it? But that's a machine brass surface down in there, and that rubber tip, that's what seats against that. That's why it's called a seat. So that's what seals off the fuel flow. Now, of course, you know, this is a nut driver thing, but just pretend with me, if you will. And so that's how that works, and it's very, 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 very simple. It's one of the most simple operations there is, but when something goes wrong, then you got problems. And so what normally happens when a float doesn't get out of adjustment on its own normally, because these things they can be adjusted, but you have to see it's got like a little cutout right there. You can adjust how high or low this flow, right? Well, let's explain that a better way. You cannot adjust how high or how low the float sits in the fuel. It's always going to sit at the same level in the fuel. When it's riding on the fuel, you can't adjust it up and down. What you do adjust is you adjust the relationship by bending this. You adjust the relationship between this end of the float and this end, between the end that floats and the end that pushes on the needle valve. So if you were to bend this, say if you were to bend this so that instead of it being like straight across like that, you bend it so that it maybe came up and then went down, this end right here was further down, then what would happen, if you think about it, you have to wrap your mind around this, but what would happen is it would take less fuel to push up far enough on this to shut the needle valve off. Remember, it's the pivot principle. You're pivoting on a fixed point right there, which is that right there. Okay, that thing don't move. So that's how you adjust the float. So if you for some reason need to adjust the float, that's how you do it. We've got another float over here, but it just a little bit differently. on this float, I'll hold you in relief there so you can see. This float has got, for one thing, this is a brass float. You'll see these a lot more often than older carburetors. But it adjusts, you adjust this little tab right here. It also has a pivot. We're talking about a pivot principle. It always has to have a method to pivot that keeps the float itself in a fixed relationship with the carburetor. Okay, does that make sense? So you don't have this thing flopping all over. It sits in a certain spot right there. But what adjusts on this one, this happens to be a Carter BBD 2-barrel carburetor float. And I know on that carburetor, that is one of, let me see, I think that's one of these right here. This one has got a center front end, what they call a front end, IN, fuel inlet. So the needle valve on this carburetor is horizontal, it's facing in, it's in there, the fuel is going in right here in the line, it was against it, and so it acts on this float right there because it's horizontal. So you would bend that tab, you know, to adjust the float level, because like I said, you know, the needle valve, let me make sure I explain this so it makes some sense. The needle valve can only go down so far before it bottoms out and it shuts off. That's it. That's established. There's no adjusting the bottom point of it. So when you adjust floats, you're adjusting the relationship between the fuel level and how long it takes to shut the needle valve off. So that's what you're doing. That's the bottom line to a float adjustment. That's all you do. There is no adjusting how far it sits in the fuel. I get it to sit lower in the fuel or nothing like that. It rides on the fuel. It always does. Never does anything differently. You're just simply establishing, say for instance, you can say, well, I'm going to run with the float bowl filled up halfway before it shuts the flow of fuel off, or I'm going to run it 3/4 of the way before it shuts the flow of fuel off. So that's what a float adjustment is. That's it, bottom line. That's a simple explanation for it. So normally when you rebuild a carburetor, or a carburetor is built from the factory, I've got my spec sheet somewhere, but there are specifications. You take a little piece of measuring stick thing. It's got you know, tenths of an inch and all that on it, and that's when you build this carburetor or rebuild it, you set the float level. It tells you exactly how to do that. As a matter of fact, on this sheet, I had that right here. It's called dry float level adjustment. Number one, hold float hinge pin firmly in place. That's what they're talking about right there. Number two, press down gently on float tang until seated on needle. That's that end right there. You would have a float under that. The end of the float, the needle valve would be under that. I'm sorry, needle valve. Number three, bowl cover gasket removed. Measure from top of casting to top of float, 3/16 in from toe of float. Toe is the furthest out point right there. Number four, to adjust bend float up or down. That's exactly what I've just been telling you. You bend that end right there, up or down. And it's got a whole list, depending on your carburetor number, application, etc., how to do that. So anyway, dry float level adjustment there, and it says caution, do not exert pressure on resilient needle valve. Otherwise you may mess the end of it up. So we know what a float is, we know how to adjust it, we know why we adjust it. Okay, we know what the needle valve does. And here's two different kinds of needle valves, by the way. Here's one that's out of a Quadrajet. Pretend this is a needle valve. And here's one that's different. This is actually got the part that is inside of it, down in there. That's the needle itself. And then this one has a little weight that sits down on top of it, like that. And then the float arm rides on top of that. This came out of a Carter 4-barrel, I believe. I think actually they updated that to this style when I rebuilt that one. And you've got two different kinds of floats. You've got the brass and you've got this plastic one, which is called nitrofill. And That's the big difference in them. One's brass and it's hollow, one is nitrophil, is not hollow. The things that happen to these floats that can cause flooding is that sometimes these get old and they absorb gas. I've never seen that happen in one of them, but they say they can. These are hollow and they're supposed to remain hollow, otherwise they do not float, so they can get holes in them, and when they get holes in them they take on fuel and sink, just like a boat. If a boat gets a hole in it, what's it going to do? It's going to sink. Same with a float. And when a float sinks, it don't float no more. So you have to either replace it or fix it. If you watch Musty's videos, he showed you recently how to fix a float. You can resolder them. They've got solder on them. There's many ways to fix those things. I generally try to buy a new one. Now then, the only thing that can go wrong with a float, sometimes things that go wrong with floats, sometimes they can hang on the pin. Sometimes these, if you get these have to be level when they're installed in the carburetor. These that have two different pontoons on them, sometimes they can get out of whack. I can see these are. Look how different they are. See that? That will never work. And sometimes those suckers will get so far out of whack they'll get bent or something will happen and they'll collide with the edge of the float bowl over here, and what happens is they stick. And when that happens, it's just basically like a toilet keeps running. They stick, they don't go up, they don't close the needle valve off, the fuel keeps running. So what happens when the fuel keeps running, I've had people write to me and they say the same thing. I've heard this a lot. They say, well, there's fuel coming out everywhere out of this carburetor. It's coming out over the top, it's flooding out all over the engine. That just basically means something went wrong with either that float or that needle valve. That needle valve got dirt in it. It got something, debris down in there, and it's not closing off anymore. It's very, I'm not upset about this. I'm just saying this directly so that you don't hear any of this, oh, it feels good, la la la, rose-colored glasses stuff. I don't make my videos like that when I'm trying to teach something. That's what causes it. You got dirt in the needle valve, or you got a float that's stuck somehow. So your job is you have to take that carburetor apart and find out what happened. That float has to go up and down smoothly. If it's brass, it cannot have fuel in it. It cannot get fuel in it anywhere at any time. So if you're having problems like that, if you have to go into your carburetor and clean it out, and you've had to do that more than once, evidently you're getting dirt in it somewhere. So you need to run a couple of filters, or you need to run a better filter. You need a gas tank. You need something. But if you have a carburetor that it's coughing up gas all over the engine, not only is that a fire hazard, but you need to find out what's causing it, because, like I said, this is a very simple operation. It's not, like I said, don't take me wrong, it's not rocket science. So, I know a lot of guys don't like to dig into a carburetor, but that's what you got to do. When you drive a car that's old enough to have a carburetor, and you need to learn how to fix that carburetor, because they do act up occasionally. I've rarely had that happen. The last carburetor I had that flooded bad like that happened to be, if you go back through my videos, you'll see a one that calls Chrysler Starter Workout, and that was that 71 Plymouth that had a 318 with it had the Holly version of a BBD 2-barrel, and that thing had it had a dual nitrophil float. It means it was dual floats like this, but they were this kind of stuff. And those things, that float stuck all the time because it would swell up and it would stick on the side of the carburetor, and that's what happened in that video. When I started it, it started running, and then the carburetor filled up, and it just kept on running fuel in there, so it loaded it up so bad that it quit, and that's why I had to sit there and at some point it jogged it loose, I guess, and that's why it finally started and ran okay. But I had, with that, till I changed out that carburetor, I had problems with that all the time, and sometimes it wouldn't resolve itself. I just wouldn't go anywhere because the float was stuck, and you got some old timer, he's out there hitting it with a wrench or hitting it with a hammer. I'm telling you something, when you're having a tap on a carburetor, that ain't fixing it. You're just getting your way around something that is gonna happen again, guaranteed. So okay guys, I've rattled on for 20 minutes and my thing will reset here at 20 minutes, so I'm gonna say goodbye. So I hope you have good evening, good day, good morning, whatever, and please let me know if I can explain anything further on this. And I thank you so much for watching and rating and subscribing. We will see you later.